Hi everyone and welcome to today's episode. So this is part 4 and the final part of my recent trip to the Faroe Islands. If you watched the last episode, you know we headed north from Tórshavn to Klaksvík before returning south via Tórshavn to get some supplies to the island of Sandoy, which would be our stopping off point before we headed back to Scotland. However, on the way into Sandoy, we noticed this beautiful beach at the top of the fjord, so I decided to don my wetsuit and snorkeling gear and go and see what the waters of the Faroes had to offer. It was certainly a bit chilly and I was very glad for my thick wetsuit, although it wasn't, to be fair, that much worse than I've experienced in Scotland. The water, however, was beautifully clear, and on my swim across the bay, mostly sandy and not that interesting, I was treated to the beautiful colours and clear waters of the Faroes. On reaching the edge of the bay, I found what must have been a never-ending kelp bed running all the way along the edge of the fjord, and I spent the next half an hour or so simply floating around and looking at all the sights that were there to be seen. It was very reminiscent of my time snorkeling in Scotland and in other places around the UK like Cornwall, although I must say that it was remarkably clear and teeming with life, albeit most of it was sort of hatcheries for what looked like small pollock and things like that. I was a little bit nervous to stray too far out along the fjord, as these were unfamiliar waters and I was still pretty tired after a week and a half of sailing, but it was wonderful to refresh myself and dive into the ice cold waters and have a look what was underneath the waters we'd been floating on. Fortunately, when I emerged, it was still a beautiful sunny day as I trekked my way back across the village in full wetsuit. We had a relaxing night in this sleepy fishing harbour, and awaking the next day to calm and fine weather, we decided to cast off and head south for Scotland. Once we were out of the harbour and the fjord, we were treated to some amazing sailing. The wind was hard on our beam and we were flying along and jumping over the swell and waves that were coming in from the North Atlantic. With the relative calmness of the crossing, we were very excited for the fact that we might get some serious sailing and make some good time. Skyline's epic performance was pushing us along at around 7.5 knots through the water, and we were regularly over 10 and 11 knots thanks to a bit of tide behind us. Sadly though, as the day went on, we started to lose the wind and things calmed down a bit, making us trudge along slower and slower until eventually, unfortunately, we had to give up and pull in the sails. I had once again volunteered for the night shift, so in the early evening I turned into my bunk and set up my lee cloth so I wouldn't fall out of bed so I could grab a couple of hours sleep before my night shift. By the time I awoke, the wind had returned, albeit a lot softer and on our stern, so we had the head sail poled out, and whilst we weren't making the same breakneck speed that we were earlier, we were still comfortably pushing on at around 4 knots, and we stayed like this for most of the night. The only major point of interest was a relatively close shave, and by that I mean around 3/4 mile away from this giant tanker Snow Lotus, which is about 275 meters long, although it passed ahead of us with no major issues. Come morning, we had pulled the head sail in and were back on the motor because we had lost the wind entirely, and I headed to bed with the drone of the engine in my ears. When I eventually crawled out of my bunk around lunchtime, it was a beautiful blue sky with oily, flat waters again. Life on board had deteriorated significantly though, and we were resorting to using long life milk in our cappuccinos. As this beautiful day carried on, the island of North Rona came into view, and as we weren't doing much other than just motoring along, we decided we would stop off at the island and do a little bit of fishing. Once again, Jim's spidey sense had kicked in and sensed that there might be some good fishing here, and he certainly wasn't wrong. Within minutes of putting our lines in, we were pulling in mackerel left, right and centre. I guess with the remoteness from land and a lack of people fishing here, the mackerel had grown to some of the biggest sizes I'd seen in quite a while, and certainly the largest we'd seen on the trip. As I pulled in a measly one nice one, Jim was pulling in 4 or 5 on the other side of the boat. However, not to be outdone, as soon as I threw my line back in, I once again hooked onto a number of pretty large and impressive mackerel.
Oh my god, big one. Or multiple. I think you got those shallow as well. Yeah, listen right here. Oh, it's just gone. Oh no, it's still in. Oh, I got 3.
Whilst I have cut down this clip a little bit, this is practically real time, and all of these fish were caught in less than about 10 minutes of just putting the engine into idle and bobbing around off the island of Rona. I even caught this spectacular pollock, which was a beautiful fish, but I decided that we wouldn't keep it as we had more than enough fish now to carry us through to the end of the trip. So after taking a celebratory photo and video of it, I simply put it back in the water.
This is where you should come out the boat with it.
So less than 15 minutes after we put the engine to idle, we were back on our way with a tray of beautiful mackerel for dinner that night. We left Rona behind us and carried on south towards Scotland, again with not much wind and simply just motoring along, but it was still a pleasant afternoon. That evening we slummed it with our fresh mackerel and roasted potatoes, and we had a lovely meal together out on deck before everyone else turned in and I once again took the night shift. The wind had returned and we got the headsail poled out. We were making about 3.5 knots for most of the night, so that was worthwhile, and we also got our first glimpses of the lighthouses of Scotland. I turned in the early hours of the morning, but didn't manage to stay in bed for long because I was rudely awoken by a pod of dolphins jumping and frolicking around the front of the boat. This was certainly one of the bucket list moments of the trip, as we'd been hoping to see dolphins this close for the last 2 weeks. We had seen a few in the distance and the odd one that had sort of swung by the boat at a little bit of a distance, but these ones were intent on staying with us for a good 20 to 30 minutes, and despite my sleep deprived state, I spent the whole time out there sitting on the front and just enjoying this magical bucket list sailing moment. All good things must come to an end though, and eventually they'd had their fun with us and they headed off at the distance, so I turned in back to bed. When I awoke later on, the day was beautiful and sunny, and the guys had got the sail poled out once again as the wind had come round behind us, and once again we had no engine. With light winds behind us and a straight course ahead, we decided that we would give the asymmetric a go. So we brought in the pulled out head sail and began preparing the sail. For me, this was a great experience because this was only the second time on the trip we'd used the asymmetric, and this was the first trip that I'd ever had the opportunity to use one. We had a little bit of struggle getting it up the first time, as the wind was shifting around a little bit and we were struggling to keep the wind exactly behind us. However, I also at this point learned a valuable lesson. As it was a beautiful sunny day, I was up on deck with no shoes on, feeling confident and bohemian, and I learned a lesson about watching where your feet are on the deck when working with any sails, particularly large asymmetric like this. As I attempted to help the asymmetric work its way around the forestay, the tack had come loose from the mast, and when the sail popped, the rope was underneath my foot. This resulted in a pretty nasty rope burn on the bottom of my foot, which was quite painful, but to be honest, I feel I got away lucky. That could have been a particularly nasty and dangerous situation, and I feel like it was a small price to pay for a very valuable lesson. And when we readjusted and finally got the sail up, I was a lot more careful about where I was standing and what I was doing on deck. After the drama of putting the sail up, we then had a good 5 to 10 hours of simply sailing downwind with the asymmetric just pulling us along at a beautiful and gentle rate. So we were able to relax on jet deck and enjoy the sunshine, and also as we now had internet, we were able to catch up with loved ones and tell them that we had survived the trip. We continued south for the rest of the day, heading back towards the Sky Bridge where our trip had started a few weeks ago, before we had to pull down the sail, and as we weren't quite confident enough to sail straight under the Sky Bridge with it. Fortunately, the pulling down of the sail went a lot more smoothly and safely than the putting up of the sail, and we were soon motoring our way underneath the bridge once more. Whilst we still had a ways to go back to Mallaig where our cars were and the end of the trip would be officially, this very much felt like the start of the home stretch as we drifted under the bridge. After passing back through the Cowls of Ree with the tide rushing behind us, we decided we would spend the night in a small anchorage just north of Mallaig. We found this little cove at the entrance to Loch Horn, and whilst there was a couple of boats already anchored in here, there was plenty of space for us to fit in behind them. So we found a suitable spot and we let out the anchor before turning in for a restful night in this little bay. The next morning was another beautiful, calm day. We enjoyed some breakfast and coffees before pulling up the anchor and heading south for our final leg to Mallaig. Once back in Mallaig, Jim had planned to do some maintenance on the furler for the mainsail, so while he still had a couple of extra hands on board, we set to work removing the mainsail and also preparing the boom to be removed once we got into port. Bringing down the sail and packing it away whilst underway was a little bit tricky, but it was a calm day, and with 3 people on board we were able to do it relatively easily, and before you knew it she was folded up in her sail bag and we were back on our way to Mallaig. Mallaig was a hive of activity, with pontoons being repaired and this beautiful tall ship anchored up on the main pier, but we were able to find ourselves a slip and head on in. So we tied up Skyline for the last time, and that was the end of our trip. All that was left at that point was to pack up all of our belongings, say our fond farewells to each other, and go rescue our cars for where we'd stashed them a couple of weeks earlier. Fortunately, they were still there, so I was able to get on the road and head south back towards Hattrick. All in all, this trip was a fantastic trip. Although it wasn't that exciting, we didn't necessarily get the kind of rough North Atlantic sailing that I'd kind of envisaged we might. I still feel like I learned a hell of a lot, and I met 2 amazing people who I really enjoyed spending the time with. So I hope you've enjoyed following along with me on this trip. It's been pretty sad to not be able to get out on Hattrick this year and take you on adventures on the new boat, but unfortunately that just wasn't going to be the case with the engine issues we've faced. However, we are confident that we are going to get the boat up and running, and next year we'll be able to go on our own adventures. Thank you so much for stopping by. Remember to like and subscribe if you want to follow along with our sailing adventures, and I will see you in the next episode.